Uh, well, let me tell you a story about a gentleman you may have heard of before. His name is Dmitry Ivanovsky. Dmitry was a Russian botanist who in 1887 was asked to investigate a problem. Tobacco plantations in Ukraine and Crimea had huge swaths of plants dying off from some mysterious disease. No one could figure out what it was. Dmitry discovered that an extremely small agent, invisible to the naked eye, and something that no one had a name for, was spreading and replicating itself from one plant to the next. And several years later, a Dutch microbiologist named Martinus Viziernik followed up on Dmitry's discovery, and he gave the mysterious tiny infectious thing a name. He called it a virus. Now, people had known for years already that disease could spread from one living thing to the next, but by the time Dmitry came along, they already knew about bacteria, but the discovery of the virus caused a real paradigm shift in science, a whole new way of understanding how disease spreads. So if you know how it spreads, then you can figure out how to keep it from spreading, and eventually you can develop therapies and vaccines to stop it in its tracks. So the next time you get a shot for the flu or RSV or COVID, it might be nice to say a little prayer of thanks for Dmitry and Martinus, because the paradigm shift that these two scientists gave birth to has literally saved the lives of millions, maybe even your very own. Paradigm shift is, of course, a basic change in our underlying assumptions and how things are perceived, the lens through which we view the world, and also a shift in how we respond to that new understanding. Now, we often imagine paradigm shifts as being these sudden eureka moments, like a scientist in a lab discovering a virus. But the truth is, a shift in paradigm is usually more gradual, and it can happen in many ways, personally, culturally, socially. It can even happen spiritually. And it's important to be aware of paradigms because it can help explain why things happen the way they sometimes do. It's no secret that today in our country, people are divided politically as never before. It's as if we're viewing the same reality, but we understand and interpret that reality through two distinct, at least, and competing sets of lenses. It can be rather disorienting to realize that that is going on. For example, if you're like me, the attack on the U.S. Capitol building on January 6, 2021, not only caused a lot of distress beyond being upset that people were attempting to disrupt a lawful democratic process and harm their political enemies, and their actions resulted in people dying. Aside from all that, was the distress of realizing that a group of our fellow citizens could even have a perspective that would cause them to feel justified in attacking the Capitol building, smashing windows, beating up police officers. I'm still very interested in how we can understand why we would have such a deep chasm in the first place between two seemingly irreconcilable perspectives on what happened that day. Two competing paradigms, really. I'm very interested in how, as good citizens and as people of faith, we can work to bridge that chasm, how we can learn to really listen to each other and truly understand one another, to stop demonizing one another, and regain mutual respect and high regard of one another. So what we know for sure is how we view reality matters a lot. It matters not only for the long-term health and well-being of a society and our world, but personally, it matters to us spiritually. I happen to believe humans are spiritually connected, that we are all children of God, and that we're knit together in a mutual interconnected bond of love. So that is my personal paradigm. That's the lens through which I view things. And my worldview is that we're here for a very brief moment in time for the very purpose of loving and helping each other. And my own model for that way of looking at things and living comes from a first century rabbi named Jesus. But I didn't adopt that paradigm in an instant aha moment. For me, it was a gradual shift. Happened over time. The Jesus I had grown up hearing about was a figure whose sole purpose, as it related to me, was to die for my sins so that I could go to heaven. Now, I still believe in heaven, but I no longer think of it as a personal reward for believing the right things or for reciting the right formula. I don't view my afterlife as some kind of exclusive address, a place that's reserved for those who happen to attend the right church that teaches the right doctrines while everyone else is punished. My gradual paradigm shift occurred as I came to see that my early understanding of Christianity as presumptuous and controlling and even selfish. After all, it's ultimately, if it is ultimately about saving your own skin when you die, then it's all about you. It's not about caring about anybody else. I also realized that the religious perspective I grew up with flies in the face of how a loving and gracious God would actually behave in my best imagining of that. That means, in a nutshell, I no longer believe, as I did in my youth, that God sends anyone to hell. And how would we even presume to know how God would behave? That's a good question to ask ourselves. But I think we have a pretty good idea if we bother to take a look at what Jesus said and did, which is consistently positive, hopeful, and healing, consistently challenging us to free ourselves from an us against them zero-sum mindset, challenging us to see the world through the lens of being in justice-filled, loving relationships with each other. To understand that life is not about serving yourself or saving your own hide in the afterlife, but doing all you can to serve and do right by others in this life. Because we're all valuable. We're all worth it. We're all loved by God. And when we truly live that way, we're experiencing the kingdom of heaven. We're experiencing healing and forgiveness and wholeness. We're experiencing salvation. Sometimes a little bit at a time, day by day, other times a whole lot all at once. Now, I could offer plenty of examples and stories that Jesus told about that, but there was one incident in his life that demonstrated a shift in how people perceived him, a paradigm through which they understood him and his purpose, his reason for being. Now, we call it the Transfiguration. Fancy word for that moment when Jesus took his three closest friends to a mountaintop, and what they witnessed changed their perspective completely. Like any Bible story, it's important to look at what happened just before the story takes place and right after it. We always need some context. So just before, Jesus had been preaching, teaching, and healing, and had somehow fed 4,000 people with very little food to start out with. It was all amazing, and it was getting him plenty of attention. And the disciples, it seems, believed that this all might lead to something really, really big. Namely, they believed it could lead to serious political power for Jesus and them. Because Jesus was clearly a force to be reckoned. He was a mover like no one had ever seen before. But Jesus quickly disavows any idea that he is interested in their understanding of power. Because the power they had in mind was really temporary. It involved winners and losers, those on the inside and those left out. He tells them his power was nothing at all like that. So a few days later, they climb up to the mountain where, right before their eyes, Jesus is transformed into a glowing figure, and he's joined for a moment by two legendary but long dead heroes from history, Moses and Elijah. Just as soon as it began, the show was over, and they head back down the mountain. What did that all mean? Well, they soon run into a crowd surrounding a young boy who's been possessed by an evil spirit since early childhood. Maybe today we'd say he was psychotic. No one can help this boy, but Jesus does. He lifts the boy up, and the boy goes about his business, perfectly normal and sane for the first time in his life. So the whole arc of that story, from before the transfiguration to after, was a paradigm shift. A new way of seeing the purpose of the power of God's love, not to be tied to the way we usually define power, and to be connected to the long continuum of God's loving presence in the world through people like Moses and Elijah. And then what's the ultimate purpose of that presence and that power? Healing, wholeness, fixing what is broken, taking a hopeless crisis and restoring hope. Where there was only despair and chaos, giving life and meaning and purpose. saying to a child who everyone thought was a lost cause, "You're not a lost cause at all. You matter. You're valuable. You are loved. No matter what anyone else says, I know better. The power of God's love flows through me to connect with the healing love of God that's in you." We're well aware that there are people we share this planet with who view the world through a lens of scarcity, bigotry, and maintaining the power they believe is their birthright. We can spot them anytime we hear the language of building walls, anxiety about the other, classifying people based on race or religion or ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender identity. Very often a conspiracy-fueled, fear-based perspective. Fear is a dangerous thing that can have large-scale consequences, far more powerful and enduring any of that, in spite of what I just described, is a longer-term paradigm shift that I'm also seeing toward an understanding of humanity as being bound together in a common destiny, knowing that we need each other and must trust each other and be there for each other and work with each other. That we must heal those who are hurting, lift up those who have fallen, protect those who are vulnerable, and give ourselves to those who need help. It's a spiritual awakening to view each other as children of a loving God, where everyone is regarded as valuable, as worth it, and as loved. That's a paradigm shift of heaven on earth. Still very much in process, but well worth the effort to make it real. The good news is, with the power of God's love flowing through us, and it does, we're already doing that through this community of loving and committed people. So that is our paradigm. That's our vision. That's our reality. That's our cause.